fact that our faith really has no meaning at all, no value, if Jesus is not raised from the dead. But he is. He's alive, and he's reigning on high. And that is the cornerstone. That is the basis of our faith. We want to continue to talk about foundations today and choices. Today, the choice I want to ask you about is in whom you put your trust. We talk about, as Christians, trusting God, walking in his ways, trusting him for all of our needs. We sing about being in his presence, trusting that he is with us no matter where we go or what we do. But if we were honest with each other, I think most of us would admit, maybe privately, maybe not publicly, but trust is a tough thing to do. In the comings and goings of life, the challenges, the struggles, it's sometimes particularly difficult to trust him. Maybe we don't struggle to trust him in the larger things, but is he paying attention to me and the smaller things in my life? Is he aware of the decisions that I'm trying to make and, well, maybe the smaller fears that I struggle with? I think it's easy for us to remember that, yes, he's taken care of fears like fear of death, fear of what's going to happen to me after death. But is he present with us? Is he interested? Is he involved? Can he be trusted or counted on to answer us and meet our needs in the small things? There's a story in the Old Testament that speaks of this kind of trust and of choosing to trust God in all things. Choosing when maybe there's not an outward reason. Maybe there's not a big event coming up that we have to place our trust in him. It's just in the comings and goings of the routines of our lives. I invite you this morning to, if you brought your Bible with you, to take it out and open to 1 Samuel. If you don't know where 1 Samuel is, it's back kind of at the beginning, not too far into the Bible. You can find it. Just take a minute and locate it. 1 Samuel, we're going to look at chapter 16 this morning. It's a story that's probably familiar to you if you've been in church. It's the story of David being anointed by Samuel, the prophet, to become king one day. Not king right away, but king one day. And King David, we have lots of stories of in the Bible. He is spoken of both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But I want us to look this morning at his early life. And again, I suspect many of you know at least the story in general, maybe some of the details, maybe all of the details. But I want us to look at it this morning because it speaks to us of choosing to trust God in all times and all places when no one else is looking, and how that can impact our lives, not just in the now, but in the future. If you remember the story, you'll know that Samuel was a prophet in Israel. Samuel was a prophet in the days when the Israelites were going through a lot of transition. They had been pulled together by God. You remember the larger story. They'd been brought together as a people when God brought them out of slavery in Egypt. And God had promised to be their God, and they were going to be his people. He was going to be their ruler, and they would follow his ways. He had given them the instruction, the law, the 10 Commandments, and other ways to identify them as a set-apart people, a people who were identified with this God, Yahweh in particular. They had been following him in a lot of ways and not following him in some ways. They had been in an area where there were a lot of different people groups around them that did not worship this God. They did not recognize him. And the Israelites were repeatedly tempted to look elsewhere, to see what they had, to look at their gods, to see how they were benefited in daily life, but also in the battles that they had with each other. And the temptation grew and grew to the point that the people of Israel, the leaders, came to Samuel the prophet, and he said, "We want our own king." Now you can imagine what a prophet of God would think when he heard this from the people. Samuel was Samuel was appointed by God as his spokesman. Samuel was speaking for God and representing God, the King of Israel, to the people. And so to hear the people come back to him and say, "We want a king," well, there was obvious rebellion in that. There had to be insult. And Samuel was, in fact, highly insulted. Not because he was the king, but because he was loyal to God, and God had been their faithful king, and they were thumbing their nose at him. They were saying, "You're not good enough. We want a king of our own." Now, they didn't say those words, but that's what Samuel took their request. That's the way he took that request. And you'll find this in the early chapters of 1 Samuel, particularly in 1 Samuel chapter 8. So God had heard them, and he said to Samuel, in effect, my paraphrase, I'm not quoting it, but he said in effect, "Samuel, don't be upset with them in terms of their rebellion to you. Don't be insulted. This is about me. This is their rebellion to me, against me. But I want you to do what they've said. We're going to anoint a king. I'm going to appoint for them a king, and I want you to tell them ahead of time what it's going to be like when they have their own earthly king." And if you haven't read that story, I invite you to do that, either this afternoon or sometime this week. It's a fascinating story, and I will refer to it, I know, again, because it reminds me so much what God told the Israelites through Samuel. You're going to get your king. You're going to get your earthly ruler. But beware, because it won't turn out like you think it will. When you read the warnings of what he said, it's shocking how much we people across the planet experience some of the same things God warned the Israelites about. Because, in fact, every human leader is what? Human. And not just perfect human like God created, fallen human, rebellious humans, humans that have no longer been walking with God fully, and so we've been following leaders now who are broken themselves. And inevitably, power gets in the way, right? We know what happens when power gets into the head of a leader. They begin to take advantage of those underneath them. This was what God was warning. When you look anywhere but to me for your leadership, you're going to get someone that's eventually going to look more for their own good than for yours. And it's going to result in things you don't want any part of. Well, they asked for it. They didn't back down. And so we find ourselves this morning in the part of the story where this is going to come about. Now, God had already anointed the first king, and that was Samuel. Samuel had anointed the first king for God, and that was Saul. And Saul looked like the kind of king you'd want. He looked like the leader that we would want. He was big and tall and had all the appearance of a good, strong leader. And I have no doubt that they had every confidence that now finally they were going to be a people that could stand up against all these people groups and armies around them. As you work your way from chapter 8 to chapter 16, what you find is that Saul fell into the practices God had said would happen. And in fact, he ends up rebelling against God himself, not intentionally, maybe. He rebels in the sense that he didn't recognize his authority. God gave Saul a specific command when he was to go in and defeat one of those people groups, the Amalekites. And Saul did part of what God told him, but then he did part of what he thought was best. And we learn from this story and many others that when any of us choose to take part of what God has asked us to do and then make our own decision for the rest of it, well, there's a divided heart, right? There's a division that occurs. Only part of what we're doing acknowledges that He's our God. Because let's face it, how can you be God? How can you have all authority over any of us if we only do part of what you say? If we look to ourselves to answer the rest of our needs, well, then there's a division. And that's what had been taking place in Saul. And Samuel goes to Saul and he confronts him. And he tells him, you have offended the Lord, you have rejected him, and because you've rejected God, he's now going to reject you. And you're no longer going to continue to be the anointed king of Israel. At the end of chapter 15, Samuel followed through with what Saul had been instructed to do. Samuel, in fact, finished the job that God had asked Saul to do. And it says in verse 34, after this had occurred, then Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul, and until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again. This is the prophet of God. This is the one who was the voice of God to his leader. That communication ended. And though Samuel mourned for Saul, the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. We pick up today's story at the beginning of 16. The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I've chosen one of his sons to be king. But Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul hears about it, he'll kill me. The Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate. We get a clue there to a significant part of our story, in that he says, you are to anoint for me the one I indicate. You kind of get the idea, why would he say that? Maybe it's not going to be the one Samuel expects. Samuel, however, did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, and the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They trembled, folks, because this job that he finished that Saul had not done was to kill the enemy king that had been defeated. How many prophets or priests or preachers do you know that if that was their response to a command God had given, wouldn't receive a bit of surprise when they showed up in the group that they met with the following week? Samuel replied, yes, I have come in peace. They wanted to know, have you come here to do to us what you did to him? Have you come to stir up trouble? It's interesting that when we begin to follow our own ways, when we begin to look to ourselves for the answers and the guidance in our lives, we begin to look at God with suspicion and his people with suspicion. Are you for good, or are you going to hurt us? Samuel said, yes, I have come in peace. I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. So consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. And they did this, and you skip down in verse 6, and it says, when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab. This was the oldest son of Jesse. And he thought to himself, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. Apparently, this was a similar looking man to Saul. He too outwardly looked like the leader you would choose. The Lord said, no, not him. The story goes on, and I won't read all of it to you, but the story goes on to talk about one after another, all the way through the 7 sons of Jesse that were brought in and stood before Samuel, expecting both from their father Jesse and Samuel that surely this next one will be the one God will anoint. Surely this next one's going to be the new king of Israel. But they went through all 7, and God had not chosen any of those. So down in verse 11, he asks Jesse, are these all the sons you have? And Jesse answers, there is still the youngest. He's tending the sheep. Never occurred to Jesse that this youngest son might be the one. There surely wasn't anything about him that was king-worthy, right? Surely he didn't appear to be one who would be selected king. So Jesse didn't even summon him. He wasn't even considered. But at Samuel's request, he brings him in from the fields. And he was glowing with health, and he had fine appearance and some handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David, this youngest son, not even considered by the men in the room as king-worthy. The Spirit of the Lord from that day on came powerfully upon David. And Samuel went back to Ramah. There are a number of things to look at in this story that speak of trust. One of those, obviously, I've already alluded to, and that is the fact that the spokesman of God, the prophet of God, Samuel, is asked to do some pretty radical things. And he trusts God completely. And he does what he's asked to do, no matter how radical it may seem, no matter how unfit Samuel may have felt. God asked him to do something. God commanded him to do something, and he did it. Even when he comes to anoint the new king. And none of the people that looked like they would be worthy of being king was selected. But there's another part of this story that reveals to us trust. It's a part of the story that we often hear told in Sunday school classes or children's times when you talk about David and killing the lion or killing the bear. You know, he was a tough protector of the sheep. It comes up a few chapters later when, of all things, the Israelites are at battle with the Philistines. And they march out their big, huge champion. You remember his name? Sure, everybody knows that story. And everybody's trembling. All the men of Israel are trembling. Here's this huge giant. Nobody can possibly defeat him. And you skip way through the story, and it ends up this little shepherd boy, this one who was no account, apparently not even considered worthy by his dad to be king, steps forward and says, "Hey, I can do this." And they said, "Well, surely we need to." So king puts all the armor on him, and it weighs him down, you remember. He's clunking around. You can imagine this little kid, you know. And this is not going to work. And he gets rid of all of that. And he does what nobody would advise him to do. He takes a slingshot and a rock. Really? You're going to go into battle with that? It is a well-known story. And the fact that David trusted God in that instance is well known. But the trust didn't start there. It started way back in the fields with the sheep. And David, in fact, gave testimony to that. And it's spoken of in the New Testament when David is held up as one who trusted God. But he's also held up for another attribute. He's in fact held up as one that will be remembered for eternity. What did God call David? A man after his own heart. And when you study the story of David, you remember all the ways he fell. He committed murder, he committed adultery, reverse order of that. And you think, how could this be a man of after God's own heart? David began early in life trusting God when nobody was looking. David began trusting God when he was just going about his normal business. David began trusting God when he had a really menial task to do. And God met him there powerfully. That was before he was anointed to be king. That was before the Scripture says the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him. It's instructive to me today, and maybe it is to you, because what it tells me is that God calls us to trust Him in the little things. God calls us to trust Him in our normal routines. God calls us to trust Him when nobody's looking. God calls us to trust Him when we may face some things that are really challenging to us, even though they may be unnoticed by others. And when David trusted God, God met him and began to form in him a confidence. That kind of trust. Not just a trust in saying, yes, I trust God to forgive my sins. We find it pretty easy to do that, don't we, as Christians? I confess that He's God. I confess that I'm a sinner. I confess that I need His forgiveness. He said He would forgive me. Okay, He did. I'm good to go. But when I'm facing a task that's challenging, when I'm facing just a normal part of my life that I'm really stressed over, apprehensive about, not looking forward to, wondering how I'm going to get through it, where's the trust, you know? And I'm not pointing at you. I mean, this is my life. This is me as well. How many times I have stood before you or my wife or my parents or whoever else, and I've said, yeah, I trust God. And then when I'm presented with a challenge in my normal Monday through Friday life, I start worrying. How am I going to get this done? Well, or maybe I'm not worrying. Maybe I just immediately begin to figure out what am I going to do to try to overcome this. Who do I know? I can't do this myself. How can I get this done? I know it's a common experience, because what do we Christians often say to someone when they're really in need and we're trying to figure out what we can do for them? Besides praying, what else can I do for you? Anybody ever said that? We want to help people, and sometimes we're not meaning we don't trust the Lord, but sometimes we feel like praying and trusting is, well, maybe we can do some additional things. And the reality is that sometimes when we are facing our own challenge, a health struggle, a challenge at work, a relational struggle, some area of brokenness in our lives, we find it hard to trust God with the confidence that David must have had when the bear or the lion was attacking. I'm going to guess none of you nor me, I know I don't have to guess about me, I'm going to guess about you, we've not faced a charging bear or a charging lion. But I'm smart enough to know that if one was charging me, it's probably not going to work to say, can you hang on just a second? I need to talk to God about this. Again, I'm making kind of a silly point, but you know what I'm talking about. In that moment, you don't have any time to wait. And if that's the time when you're first considering whether or not you're going to trust God, not sure how it's going to turn out. And I don't mean that ugly against God. I mean that to say He gives us opportunities when we're not in crisis to begin to trust Him, so that when we're in crisis, the relationship is already established and the confidence is in us. That's what took place in David's life. David began to trust early on. And so that when he faced the charging animal, the trust was already there. And so when he faced the giant Goliath, the trust was already there. So I ask you today, just like last week I asked you, what are you going to base your faith on? What are you going to use as the foundation in your life for your faith other than the resurrection of Jesus? Today I want to ask you, what are you going to base your trust on? And when are you going to start putting that into practice? When am I going to start when no one's looking and I'm facing the daily challenges? When am I going to begin to start trusting that God will bring about His goodwill? And you say, yeah, but wait a minute. How many times do we pray and that doesn't work out? Well, did not David run into some difficulties and he fell? Did not David have some major challenges from his children? God doesn't promise us a life without suffering. God doesn't promise us a life without challenges. As a matter of fact, He called every one of us who will follow, again, to do what we already know, and that's to lay down our lives, lay down our agenda, be willing to suffer right along with Jesus for God's kingdom to come about. Somewhere along the line, we got in our heads maybe that this way of being a Christian should be without suffering. And I say that because I listen to me and my thoughts just like I listen to you when we're asking for prayer. What do we pray for? How do we approach prayer? I don't mean every instance. But I'm confident, because I've encountered it again just this week. Just this week. An opportunity to ask myself very sincerely, do you trust God with everything? You're a preacher, for crying out loud. Do you trust Him with everything? Do you trust Him to bring about His goodwill? Are you willing to put your life in His hands? God comes into our presence to bring about His goodwill. God comes into our presence to demonstrate His love for us. God has given us His grace and His Spirit to enable us to live an extraordinary life of trust and faith. But it only comes about when we begin to practice it over and over and over and over in the daily moments when no one else is looking. Friends, I invite you today. Maybe one or two of you have not made this decision before. Maybe you've actually not put your whole trust in the Lord for all of your life. But I suspect many of you have put some trust in the Lord. But you know without me having to ask, and you know without having to say out loud, that there are things you're still struggling with in your just regular routine of life. That if you were to begin to trust God, it would demonstrate a significant degree of confidence you've not shown in Him before. And when you begin to do that, you're going to experience a new part of your relationship with the Lord, because He'll meet you there and you'll know it. I invite you to make those kind of decisions once again today and each day through this week. Lord, when I face those little things, those little annoying things, those little things that I just can't quite seem to get over, when I find myself thinking, how am I going to, okay, who do I know? How am I going to? Have I stopped and prayed and asked God to show me what He wants me to do, and then trusted Him enough to do it, even if the instruction goes against what I would normally do? Take a chance on it. Risk it. He's worth it.